So in terms of the audio setup, again, this is some housekeeping. If you are using a mic, please use the headphones to avoid feedback. As you know, built-in speakers and microphones create echoes and feedback and spoil the session for others, as we well aware in this Zoom Zoom phase we're in at the moment. And also just remember to do that, click on the profile icon at the bottom of your screen and select set up your camera and microphone. In terms of navigation, and again, I'm sure you're all already familiar with Zoom functions, but just to briefly go over how to engage in today's webinar. So you can make sure your mic and camera are turned off, and you can raise your hand when you want to speak in the participants icon there, and you can ask questions and interact with the chat. And we'll be using the chat panel to answer any questions. And again, in the chat, remember to change the drop-down menu to all participants and attendees so everyone can see your questions. So time is allocated for asking questions, as you've seen for the agenda. We'll encourage you to ask your questions using the mic if possible. If you have a mic, please use the raise hand icon in the participants menu. If you don't have a mic, prefix any questions in the chat with a Q in the drop-down menu next to the Q, and remember to select all participants and attendees so everyone can see your questions or question. And my colleague, Jennifer Sanchez-Davis, colleague at Jisc, who's the OA support coordinator, will be managing the chat for us today. So just the next slide. And again, the session will be recorded. So for those of you who've just joined, please make sure you type your name and institution into the chat so we can have a record of participants. And so just to say again, so this is part 2 of a series of webinars, and this would have been a face-to-face meeting. So we've now had to pivot to online meetings, and we're now we've split up those as a part of several streams, webinar streams. So we had stream 1 on the 6th of May, and we had updates reports from the consortium. We had a featured speaker, and we had and the slides and recordings will be available from the event page, and from that event page at the bottom we'll be sending those details out to people as well. And obviously this stream is focused on member and practitioner experience, and we will be having a stream 3 which will be breakouts and birds of a feather sessions, and we'll say more about at the end of this meeting. I'm now going to hand over to Adam to introduce the next session.
Hi, thanks, Balvier. So what we're going to do now is have 3 presentations from members of the UK ORCID consortium. Bless you, Dana. And starting with Lee Stork from Aston University. So stop sharing Balvier's screen. And Lee, if you could start your presentation, please. Each of these presentations we're just going to let run through. If you have a question that occurs to you, please just put them in the chat. Especially if at the end of the presentation, if you type them into the chat, and Jennifer and I will be watching the chat for that, and we'll moderate them all and get them all together at the Q&A time that we have at the end of the 3 presentations. So with that, introduce Lee Stork from Aston University.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about how we made ORCIDs work for us at Aston over the past couple of years. So if you're not familiar with it, Aston University is in Birmingham. We've got about 15,500 students, over 800 academic staff, and these are split between 5 schools. So we're a smallish university. And so I'll be naming a few things, but just as a bit of a background, we've got Pure as our CRIS, and this is connected to ePrints, and that's Aston Publications Explorer, which, as you can guess, is our publications repository. We've also got Aston Research Explorer, which is the front end of Pure for us, and that's our research portal, which highlights the academic profiles, the department profiles, and things like that. Separately, we also have an ePrints-based data repository called Aston Data Explorer. So not very creative names, I'm afraid. So like I said, I joined Aston in March of 2018. And after the sort of the initial getting to know the university phase, I sat down with my counterpart in the Research and Knowledge Exchange Office. And between the two of us, we decided ownership about who was going to be in charge of systems, of workflows, of practices, and things like that. And that was really just to focus our minds and avoid confusion. And once we had that in place, we reviewed workflows, policies, integrations, and that was to see what was working for us, what wasn't working, what needed to be updated, and things like that. And part of this exercise, we identified our own personal knowledge and skills gaps. So things where, you know, we could fix by watching a webinar, by Googling it, but other things where we needed some external training and things on. And as you can imagine, this generated quite a massive to-do list. And so we had some goals and timescales in mind to get some of these issues sorted. But really, the key thing about sorting these things was about forming relationships, both within the university, things like IT departments and senior management staff, but also external relationships, things that we learned through mailing lists or through talking to our system providers and things like that. And those relationships were quite integral to getting some of these changes enacted. So what's changed in the past 2 years for us? Well, the big thing initially was getting ORCIDs sent through our connector from Pure to ePrints, and that was done in May of 2018. So Pure by default does not like connected repositories. So the out-of-the-box settings are really quite basic. So you have to do a lot of modification of the XSLT file in Pure to get the metadata that you want sent through to your repository. So this is one of the things where we didn't have the expertise locally to do this. So we were lucky enough, though, that our ePrints host, CoSector, had someone on staff who could help us with this. So once we got this new XSLT file, put it in Pure, refreshed the records, and suddenly we had ORCIDs in our repository. And so that start to finish maybe took about 2 weeks or so. So it was a really quick fix once we got the skills that we needed. And then immediately after we had ORCIDs in our repository, the next thing to do was to get these ORCIDs harvested by Iris UK. And I was able to get this done with the help of Paul Needham and Jisc. It was a massive amount of help with this. So what you can see on the left-hand graph is the number of ORCIDs from June of 2018 through to, I think, about last week. So steady increase over time. We've started to flatline a bit as we get towards the upper limit of our staff numbers, and we've got those few holdouts who refuse to sign up. And then the graph on the right-hand side is the number of repository records with at least one ORCID on them. So again, the massive spike when we had the repository refresh, and then again, a steady increase over time. And so I think we've got about 90% of our repository records, excluding PhD theses, that have at least one ORCID on them now. So we're going quite strong, which is good. So some of the technical developments in the last 2 years that I can't take credit for. So Pure has had an integration with ORCID since early 2016, I think, but it wasn't until, sorry, and this is what it looks like when people link their ORCIDs in their Pure profiles. But it wasn't until October of 2018 that the push and pull relationship between Pure and ORCID started. And so once this push and pull relationship was enacted, we can have ORCIDs as an import source. And when our researchers link their ORCIDs to their peer profiles, they get prompts that they have records to import from ORCID, as you can see there. And that push and pull relationship was a huge game changer for us, especially in terms of messaging. So our messaging now is that ORCID does the work for you, because we don't have a requirement for ORCIDs at Aston, so we need something else to convince people to sign up. So what we tell people to do is when they go into their ORCID profile, if they sign up with various sources or agree to various sources to populate their ORCID profiles, this gets pushed through to Pure automatically. And then once we validate the records in Pure, then it gets sent out to our publications repository, and it gets sent out into their personal profiles on Aston Research Explorer. If they don't want to do this through ORCID, they can also do this through their Pure profiles. So again, set up the automatic import sources, gets put into Pure, gets pushed out into ORCID. And then again, we also validate the records for the repository and the Research Explorer. But if they don't want to set up the automatic import sources, they can also add records manually, either directly into ORCID or directly into Pure. And then again, it has the push and the pull, either to ORCID or to Pure, out to the repository and out to their personal profiles. So there's a lot of arrows going on. But again, the message is that ORCID will do the work for you if you let it. So that was a really successful message that we had. And so we had about 200 new ORCIDs added after we set up this information drive. And this resulted in quite a few emails to us saying, that's great and everything, but when the records get put onto my ORCID profile, they show up as random output types, or when they're pulled into Pure, they come up as other. Why is that? And so I did a bit of research and found that the mappings between Pure and ORCID were out of sync. And so it was just an exercise of sitting down and seeing what are the content types that we have in Pure, what are the content types available in ORCID, what needs to be updated, what needs to be added, and then putting those into the XML file in Pure. And once we did that, we haven't had any issues since, although this is probably due for another look again this summer to keep it up to date. So those are the things we've done the last 2 years, but looking forward, our data repository is getting a pretty big refresh at the moment. And so one of those things that we're going to be added is ORCIDs, again, just to try and link things with people's profiles a bit better. Technically, what I would like to see happen is that Pure and ORCID need some integration quality improvements. We've got a lot of problems of duplicates not being recognized, and usually this is down to special characters or slight title differences not being picked up. And this leads to unnecessary prompts to our academic users to import things from ORCID, even if they're already in Pure. And rather oddly, whenever anything is imported from ORCID into Pure, it always puts the default language as unknown. It's a slightly annoying thing that I have to go back and fix. So something to sort that out too would be nice. But something I would like ORCID to do really is to sort out data sets. So at the moment, data sets in ORCID are under the other work category rather than having their own unique type. And so we would like ORCIDs, the data set metadata in ORCIDs to be automatically imported into Pure as well, but we can't do that at the moment because of it's just an other and Pure can't recognize that. So we would like ORCID and Pure to work together a little bit to try and get data sets as a unique output type. So I've been talking to Pure about this as well. So they recognize that it's a problem, but hopefully ORCID will make data sets their own work category as well. So that's all I've got at the moment. If anyone has any questions, please do put them into the chat. If any Pure users would like a copy of our XML or our XSLT file, I'm happy to share those as well. So please do get in touch if you have any questions. And that's me.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Lee. So next we're going to have a presentation from Robin at Imperial. Robin, if you want to start getting your slide sharing. And again, as we've said before, just say if you have particular questions, it helps if you put a capital Q at the front so as we can spot them as a question. But yeah, we'll have a Q&A at the end of these 3 presentations. Okay, Robin, are you ready to go? Fabulous, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, and you can see the slides.
And we can see the slides, they are all working
Great.
fine, as they always have, and we don't need to mention anything about that. That's great. Okay, okay, everyone, so this is Robin Price from Imperial College London. I'm still, as a naive young Northern Irish person, learning about all these London colleges. Imperial College London. Robin, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, we have in the last year upgraded our CRIS, which is symplectic elements, to their version 5.2, and with that version, there's a new functionality for ORCID. So the previous version, the previous functionality, and this is what you'll have if you're a symplectic user who hasn't updated 5.2. So users have to separately approve applications in both ORCID and in elements in CRIS, even if, say, they have added their ORCID ID in the name-based settings. So with the new 5.2 functionality, we then have this ability to read and write to ORCID. So this means that in terms of publications, new publications, and old publications, ORCID can mirror symplectic elements. So this has to be approved by the individual user manually in elements. So there became available a new sort of tab in their homepage called ORCID settings, and all they have to do is to select this first new option that became available: I permit symplectic elements to read and write. This was something that all staff had to do manually themselves, to go into the settings and to click approve. This wasn't something that we could do on their behalf, and also, as it is a sort of privacy and a personal choice question, we wouldn't have done it automatically on their behalf either. So we were faced with this question of how do we get a substantial number of staff to log in and do this administrative task. So the sort of numbers of staff that we were looking at who were eligible for this upgrade. So we have over 6,000 academic staff who are using symplectic every day. Of that, we have about 2,000 who had gone in and claimed a ORCID ID. So I really felt like that group of 2,000 authors were ones who we knew definitely had an ORCID. They had already registered with us, and they were the most likely group who would go in and make this change if we contacted them. And then within that group, we have this 900, what I've called it here, problem accounts. So this was something that was very specific to our initial configuration between symplectic and ORCID, where there were 900 members of staff who wouldn't be able to do this process so simply. And for them, we had to devise some quite detailed instructions of a manual process that they had to go through of deleting records before they could benefit from the read and write. And this, I think, really, this group is unique to Imperial. Symplectic told us we would have this problem when we did the upgrade. So I knew that, we had to tell these staff that they could benefit from the upgrade if they wanted, but that, that there were 15 steps of manual instructions that they had to follow, and that this group would generally emeritus professor level and senior faculty staff. So I knew it was a really difficult group to be able to target with this with this kind of instructions, but we put them out online, and the link to the web page of these instructions is here on the slide if you're interested to see. We sent them direct email stressing that there's an optional upgrade that they can benefit from if they wish. Here are the instructions. And I would say that I got quite a few responses, considering this was 900 members of staff that I contacted, and I think there was low compliance out of that group. But ultimately, but if these staff did not choose to do the upgrade, then nothing would change on their account. It was just them being able to take advantage of the new function. I think these problem accounts really were unique to our configuration, and so anyone else considering this, I don't think you have to worry about having this kind of group in your own organization. So phase one, the problem users, and then after they had been contacted, I move on to phase two, which was the much more positive communications that could go to the entire staff body. For them, the process of upgrading is really easy. All they have to do is be logged in into their Symplectic, choose that ORCID setting page, click approve, and it's done. So the records are automatically sent over to ORCID, and it was really fun, and I felt confident about sending communication. So we had planned to do broad level social media based communications, newsletters, email bulletins. We're going to do some physical on campus posters. However, all of this was planned for April 2020. So we have not been able to do those communications. They've been put on pause, but I'm happy to say that I think we have sort of devised very clear incentive for staff as to why they should spend those few minutes when they do have that time in doing this sort of, in going into their profile and doing the approval process, that really it's one thing that they do now that's less admin in future, so that their two profiles will be synchronized, and really I feel like it adds benefit to each, with their Symplectic, which is something they have to for their college profiles be using their ORCID, which the motivation that ORCID profile is something being kept up to date because of work that they're doing in their Symplectic. We also really promote the idea that their contributions to their ORCID will stay with them from the organisation. So it's really clear messaging of synchronizing these two accounts and adding value from one. So despite that, I feel like we had low compliance with an initial group of 900 staff who had that more complicated messaging, and our planned communications to the entire staff body have been on hold. We've had over 300 people yesterday, I checked, have submitted the read and write. So that's where we're going to be starting from when we go back to more regular everyday communications back on campus. We'll be working with and hoping to increase over time. So if anybody else is on Symplectic and going to upgrade to 5.2, I'd be really interested to speak with you, share some ideas.
Okay, so thank you very much, Robin. Do you want to stop sharing your screen, or should I do that for you? Awesome. Yeah. Okay, so finally we've got Renata McDonald from Kent, who's going to talk to us about Kent.
I think I'm just trying to share.
Fabulous. Thanks, everyone. And again, if you've got
Okay.
any questions, just pop them in the chat, preferably with a Q at the front. And after Renata's finished, we'll have a Q&A session and then a break. Okay, so finally, Renata McDonald from University of Kent will tell us about orchids at Kent. Here you go, Renata.
Thank you, Adam. I hope everybody can see my slides. So yes, my name is Renata McDonald. I'm the Research Systems and Data Manager, and I shall talk to you about the experience at the University of Kent when it comes to ORCID IDs. So first of all, a little bit of background. We've been members since around 2014, 2015. I think Kirsty Wallis, who is also here, will remember this, because this is all started with funded by the ISC ARMA project, and we had 7 PhD students working on it. At the end of this project, we had around 300 students, PhD students and staff linked to ORCID. Another wave was around 2016, when we tried to encourage staff to link their profiles to ORCID, and it was through our internal promotion process that we used it as the incentive for staff. And also at that point we had Converis system, which was a research information system, but unfortunately the approach didn't work as planned as we wanted. However, we had around 200 users who linked their ORCID via Converis at that point. So anyway, in 2018, we thought, okay, we've got already a central database, like a hub, which already talks to other Kent internal databases. So why don't we do it internally, collect the ORCID IDs internally? And we had expertise on a local expertise. We collaborated then with research services, with information services, sorry, and we of course talked to the ORCID team. So forwards and backwards, making sure the requirements, processes, communication, and so on is all defined and in place. And we were ready. Our web team created a single sign-on page, and that took us to the Kent IT account management. And here we connected, we added the Connect Your ORCID with a little bit of help text, which just helps people to understand what ORCID actually is. So that was one first step. Second step, we had to do, we had to add the splash page. That was with GDPR compliant, so we had to do that anyway. And talking to Monica from ORCID, we also added various different links which would go straight to the ORCID pages for clarity. And also it gave the opportunity, or gives the opportunity to all the staff and PhD students to opt out from the process if they wish to. Throughout the process, we recommend that email addresses are used and enforce that it belongs to them rather than the institution. So we collected the ORC IDs, we managed to store them, and then the next step is to automatically redistribute them, because this is something that useful, right? So we set up various different scripts, daily scripts that export data to our HR database, and this is for various purposes, for the REF or HISA purposes. We also set up a script which goes, sends all the ORCIDs to CAR, which is our academic repository. So all this is done automatically. We also have a template from CAR, which goes to straight to academic web profiles. This process is semi-automatic at the moment, but we were supposed to be finished, but COVID-19 delayed us a little bit. But again, what it means that just that field, ORCID field, will be automatically pushed into academic web profiles, which is great. So of course, that was excellent that was done, but our academics wouldn't know about it unless we communicated with them. So creating the awareness, typically we send information via emails, added information to blogs, updated our website. We've got an excellent research support within the library. We've got a Office of Scholarly Communications, and of course the REF office in the research services. So all three offices were contacting staff. The research support particularly are contacting new staff, so they get emails from HR with new staff lists, and then they can target those people and through inductions and so on, and also the PhD students. The REF team within research services, we concentrated purely on the REF eligible staff. So about 6 months ago, we started to contact them via email. We didn't do anything else, just let them know about ORCID and how great it is to connect ORCID through our Kent. And the response was really good. So some statistics. Before we started in 2018, we had just under 200 staff linked with Kent. And now we've got 96% of our REF submittable staff has already linked their ORCID through our Kent interface, which is fantastic. And of course, we've got more staff in the repository, which is, as last time I checked, it was 941. The PhD student number looks a little bit glim here because it's only 45, but thinking about it, in fact, it's most likely, and I will need to sort of investigate further, but it is most likely that these are only the ones who linked through the single sign-on rather than people who actually have ORCID. So I suspect there are more of them. So the benefits, I already kind of indirectly stated the benefits. You know, I think I can illustrate the time savings here and the efficiencies, not just for our academic staff, but also for our admin staff, whether it is in library, Office of Scholarly Communications, or the research services. So one of the main advantage here is that we enter once and reuse often. So people have to link once the ORCID, and the IDs appear in various different reports which we can use internally. Another really important advantage here is the single sign-on. And that's great because with this, Kent is linked to ORCID. ORCID is a link to publishers, repositories, funders. So really, researchers only need to ever remember their Kent password, and everything is secure also. It also encourages ORCID recognition for all the academic output automatically as they register with it. So that's really great, and they don't need to remember any other passwords, just the one. So that's the main benefit. And our future plans. So one thing which hasn't happened yet, but was supposed to happen already, that ORCID information was to be added in our probation pack within human resources. So that's been agreed, but I haven't seen it there yet, so that needs to be done. And speaking to the Office of Scholarly Communications, they are now planning to integrate ORCID with our open journal systems platform. So I think Monica has been already talking to Josie, and so that's really exciting when this happens. And of course, there are other things. Integrate ORCID with ePrints, because as I've been talking the whole time, so far everything has been done through a hub, like our central database. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, do ask.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So now we have Jenny watching the chat. So if you'd like to type a question into the chat, or if there are any comments, stuff to feed back, Jenny will start doing that now. Also, if you'd like to actually use the modern technology of speaking into a microphone, we're trying to watch participants list for people who might have raised their hands.
While we've got people typing away, we had a few comments earlier in relation to Lee's presentation at the beginning, when she was talking about making metadata a unique output type. Kirsty Wallace said that this is something that we'd like to push ORCID for. We've also had a comment from Tom Renner about it as well, saying that other output types like data sets, practice, research work, portfolios of work and things like that. Jonathan Eaton also commented as well, saying case studies would be another one to include. So a lot of feedback there, which is really helpful. And then we've also got Andy Mavitz as well, who listed quite a useful link called the Recommendations of ORCID Works Metadata Working Group. So that looks like it's got quite a lot of useful information. He's provided a link as well, so if people want to check that out as well.
Okay, thanks. Robin in particular, or Renata and Lee, do either of you want to comment on, I've just seen Neil pop in the bottom as well, with custom types as ontologies frequently don't exist. And this might be an opportunity for Jisc and the consortium. So we have some thoughts, but do any of the three of you in particular have mentioned particularly about data types? So who'd like to unmute and speak first?
Yes, okay, so this is Lee. So
yeah,
in
Hallie.
Pure, we're lucky enough that we can change the names for some output types, and we can add output types quite easily as well. So we can work with what ORCID has, although, you know, I agree that we need to have a bit more fine tuning with some of these. It feels like some of the ORCID output types they're just a bit, I don't know, old fashioned, just really, you know, quite the traditional types rather than sort of adjusting with the times. So I would quite like to see that if there's a user group or, you know, some sort of action committee who can sit down and come up with a you know, a more comprehensive list to put to the larger community to maybe vote on or consider. I would quite be on board with that.
Fab. Anything from Robin or Renata? Renata?
Yeah, so we've got in-house developer. So for us, it is also not a problem. I mean, could be using ePrints. It's a problem to create any mapping documents when it comes to the values. We had to do that for the ref submission as well. But yes, so I would definitely think there should be some sort of equal or some sort of agreement what sort of types were to be used, because obviously various different bodies are using slightly different types, so that would be nice to have some sort of common area.
Robin, you got anything to add?
I suppose it's important to remember that when we would set up this read and write to ORCID function, we were only sending over journal articles. So we've through this project haven't really experienced those kind of problems, but maybe if there were to be more read and write of those other output types, then that would be very important, especially if with, you know, some authors are sending over hundreds or thousands of outputs to a queue.
Okay. So as Monica's put in the chat already, the fun bit at the end of this is a bit of a kind of a knowledge test quiz, true or false, over some statements. And then we wanted to discuss with the people who are on the call, like what we could do in stream 3 as kind of breakouts and discussions around the kind of webinars going forwards for stream 3. And one of those, because we've been having discussions, especially with the practice-based community, and it's obvious here that the data sets is another important thing, is about looking at work types in the ORCID registry. So the first thing I would say is vote for that breakout session whenever that comes up. And the second thing is we're aware of this issue and we have talked to ORCID about this. And they've said that proposals for revisions and modifications to the work types, and especially the fact that things, especially arts and humanities, where there's other proposals to modify that so that, you know, it's not quite such a STEMmy kind of a vocabulary, is something that can be put forward and would certainly have more weight if it comes from a consortium rather than any other way. So that's something that we'd certainly want to support. It's something that's on our agenda and timeline, and you have an opportunity to express your support for it near the end of this particular meeting. So I hope that addresses those kind of things going forward. Does anyone else have any questions? And, okay, thanks for that, Neil. I'm now looking for raised hands. I mean, because I'm Chinese, but I always have a question in the back of my mind. Would the three of you like to comment on kind of how your advocacy's been going in these? See, I always feel like I've hit an 18th century novel now. In these times and circumstances, how's your kind of advocacy and communication been going? Where we'd normally be putting up posters and flyers and handing stuff out, and how's that changed? I think Renata, you touched on that.
Yes, so we would continue to contact people with our email, and which is kind of old-fashioned. Yeah. It's like back to the dinosaur stuff. But you know, update blogs and websites so people can contact those. And of course, now we use Teams and Zoom. So we have not actually done that yet, but thinking about it, that could be another way of getting people together and contacting them and letting them know about ORCID and what they can do.
Okay, thanks. Lee?
Yeah, I mean, we've always been quite email-based in terms of our messaging and things. So nothing has really changed for us for the most part. But, you know, again, it's getting our spreadsheet of people who still haven't signed up for an ORCID and, you know, sending them more frequent emails to sign up and or link their ORCIDs in their peer profile if they haven't done it yet. So for us, it's just ticking on. So.
Okay. Robin, how's it going?
So I and the rest of my team and the ICT repository staff, you know, we're providing our full support like we had been before, but for things like where I had that we decided not to send out that active messaging of this is a task for you to do in the month of April. That was something that we just decided was that it could just wait maybe until sort of May or June to be reaching people at at a better time. So that's
Yeah.
that kind of active communication, directly reaching out to people, asking them to do something that maybe is more of a nice to have, a nice to upgrade now rather than upgrade in the summer. But we're still doing full support for anyone who contacts us or for managing any issues.
Cool, that sounds great. Thanks for that. Okay, so last chance for people to ask questions. I think thanks to all three of you for really interesting presentations about what's been going on and how you've been addressing some of the issues with ORCID over the past seasons. So anyone else have another question before I close this and we take our break?
Adam, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's probably a broader conversation around other taxonomies. So we're talking about credit in particular.
When we had a taxonomist on the call.
I'm not a tech.
No, we do have.
You do, yes.
We do.
Yeah, so that's obviously credit is a high-level taxonomy, includes 14 roles that can be used to represent the roles typically played in contributors to the scientific scholarly output. And yeah, I just wanted to know if people were starting to think about attributing those contributors to the scholarly output. And I know that Symplectic have included credit taxonomy in their system. So it's a question to people on the panel, particularly, or anyone else, just how they see that progressing or how useful that will be.
We've got a raised hand from Diana Cornbrot.
Yep.
Hi, I found what you were saying about the credits very interesting. We use Pure, and
Yep.
I guess you could put credits. You're talking about things like the badges that some journals give, or publons that that people have been helpful reviewers or whatever, or what were you meaning by credits exactly?
So, Adam, sorry, do you want to jump in? I think my sound is doing something, my screen is doing something funny here. Yeah.
No problem. So credit is a system for whenever people contribute to a work other than the author saying exactly what they've done. So to help with there's 14 particular roles. Sorry?
It's not what I was thinking of at all. So forget my question.
That's all right. I know. So it's a way of attributing someone's contribution to a work. So it's a way to allow people to be involved in acknowledging their role, and it's a wider system than just authorship.
I see. Makes sense.
So it's from conceptualization, data curation, formal analysis, some funding, acquisition, investigation, methodology. Yeah, so there's a 14 roles. I can put the CASRI credit
Nick's
roles
just
in.
put Nick's just put the CASRI link in it, and it's just been adopted by NISO.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
Clicked on it.
Fab. And so there is an ePrints version of it. Symplectic Elements has it. Tom Renner said Haplo has it. I'm not sure that it's available in Pure as yet. But I can go and have a look at it. It's something I think is important because obviously being able to acknowledge more widely how people interact with a work is something that's important.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a raised hand from Tom Brenner as well.
Hi there. Yeah, just as I said in chat, just to expand on that a bit, the feedback we've had from our users who is that the credit list, while it's a great start and contribution is a really important thing that we want to be able to give credit for in repositories, it is like the work types discussion we were having earlier, a very science-focused list on what those contribution types are. We've done a reasonable amount of work with the University of Westminster to expand that to include a lot more roles that would be associated with practice-based research work and non-text outputs, which I know Jenny Evans at Westminster or Nina Watts will be very happy to talk to anyone who's interested in that work about on how those were put together. But also, in the same way as work types, there's an interoperability problem with ORCID. For contributors, there is as well. So even for systems that have a contributors field, if you extend that list at all, obviously you don't get any of that contribution through, which includes things like the DOI listing has the credit list, but no further fields. So I think there's a wider issue around expanding these taxonomies to include different kinds of research as well, which is not just an ORCID work type problem.
Yeah, I think the current version of credit, as far as I understand, it's limited to the kind of biomedical contributor descriptions. So as you said, it's more science focused. And I think ORCID were wanting to include this taxonomy, but they wanted it to see, a much broader taxonomy, which, had broader utility. So I think those discussions, we need to have those discussions with ORCID and the community. So there might be something in taking this work forward through, the webinars and various other groups.
Yeah. So as I understand it from talking to a couple of people involved in the NISO process, what they're expecting to do is in phase 1 to adopt the current credit, and then in phase 2 to look at expanding it. For example, symplectic elements has a much wider attribution set because they were aware of this issue. And also the work that Tom and Nina and Jenny have done as well, and to do a wider consultation on making it a more inclusive set in phase 2, so that first of all they make credit a thing within NISO. That's phase 1, and then phase 2 is making it it's terrible to word this around, but in summary, and please don't tweet and quote me on this widely, phase 2, make it a useful thing for more broadly. But that seems to be how they're going about it, so that it officially moves over to NISO, and then they can put the resource in to develop it in the way that I think many of us would like to see, out of its biomedical roots. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep. Great.
Cool. Okay. Lee, thanks for that. Okay. We're at the end of our time, so I am going to close this session now.
Oops.
Thanks for that, Brad. It's a thing whenever you create, so whenever I was using elements, it was part of the creation of the entry in the current research information system. So when you were entering the information about the work, the authors and co-authors and contributors were the people who said about whose role did what. So the individual co-authors and contributing author. Okay, thanks. And yeah, there are issues about who says what about who and everything like that, but that's a thing that needs to be sorted out and agreed in the general publishing process. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to close this now. If we look at, see if I can share the right PowerPoint. That one. See, I think the issue with Zoom is you do share and there we go. That one. So it says 11:35 break, 11:40 panel. We're 11:33 now. So at 11:40, I will start the panel and introduce Richard Degree as a chair. So if you can actually take a break, turn your cameras off, step away, do whatever you need to do, some star jumps if you've not done your Joe Wicks already this morning. And then I'll see you all at 11:40 sharp. Either put your camera on briefly or type hello back into the chat so we know you're all back again. And I'll talk to you then. Okay, thanks all very much. Speak to you shortly. Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you had a good break. I think we'll try and organize an actual coffee break. What I've been talking to several colleagues about, like, the thing that we miss is, you know, the lunch and the coffee and just kind of generally mingling and meeting people and having those discussions. And probably what we'll do is we'll schedule a Zoom call or two for just chatting, because I think, you know, I think they're really helpful, but I'm not entirely sure how we'll do that. We can do breakout room stuff. Anyway, that's not the point of this call. Point of this call is from the community when we were discussing the things for this year, which is the 5th year that we've been running the UK ORCID Consortium. When we talked about the program, they said, well, we spend a lot of time talking about the administration of ORCID and how we get to ORCID work at our institutions. And what we don't always do is reflect back on why we do that and what people are doing with ORCID, how individual researchers actually use ORCID in their practice, and what the impact of having an ORCID is, whether it's actually useful or not, and how we need to kind of work to make ORCIDs useful, whether those effective efficiencies that we talk about and do advocacy for are actually embedded in practice. So I asked Professor Richard Degree to chair. He wrote a blog post all about the fact that ORCID became useful for him, which is great, and there'll be a link in the notes to that. And Richard, you spent a 3-year term on the ORCID board, right? Being the research advocate? Is that a good?
Researcher member.
Yeah. So saying to them, you know, this is what makes ORCID useful for a researcher, yeah. And I have a bit, so I can say that Richard Degree is an acclaimed astrophysicist and prolific public speaker. He was born and raised in the Netherlands, and his successful career has allowed him to enjoy vibrant research environments in the USA, the UK, and China. And since March 2018, he's moved to Macquarie University in Sydney as Associate Dean of Global Engagement. He's received numerous prestigious awards, including the 2012 Selby Award for Excellence in Science from the Australian Academy of Science, visiting academy professorships from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a 2017 Erskine Award for Interdisciplinary Science, Student Mentoring from the University of Canterbury, that's in New Zealand. And he served as researcher member on the ORCID Board of Directors from 2017 to 2019. And I've asked Richard to chair this panel with 4 impressive professors to talk about ORCID as a lived experience. So I have 2 seconds of this slide. Here we go. Which says the wonderful people that we have. And then I will hand over to you, Richard. So we have Professor Diana Cornbrook, University of Hertfordshire, Professor Simon Tanner, King's College London. Again, I'm a simple Northern Irish lad, but apparently that's the way to do it. Professor Brad Gibson, University of Hull, Professor Rod Page from University of Glasgow. Richard.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for the invitation. Maybe you can take that panel. Yeah, good. Yeah, good evening from down under. If we were lights, you see the black window behind me, you could see Sydney Harbour, so it's a wonderful place to be here, even though we're in lockdown. To the extent that we're not even allowed to leave this country on penalty of losing your permanent residency. So it's actually quite serious. Right, so Adam contacted me to see if I was interested in chairing this panel, having served on the ORCID boards for 3 years as a researcher member. He saw my blog. The blog was an extension of a talk I gave at the consortium meeting in Atlanta last year, which was the last year of my directorship on the ORCID board. And it was the first year really that ORCID became useful to me. Now you might wonder how I got involved in ORCID if it wasn't useful to start with. I acted as scientific editor and deputy letters editor for the American Astronomical Society for about 12 years. And during about 2/3 of that time, I was a senior academic at Peking University at an international research institute there in China. The two things combined very well because I got to know the Chinese community very well. And so I could actually assign papers to possible reviewers from China. Now, the problem is that in China, most people have the same surname. And so we needed name disambiguation, and that's when ORCID appeared on my radar. Given the problems there with name disambiguation, I volunteered as ORCID ambassador for a year in China. I wasn't too successful because of the language barrier. My Chinese is only rudimentary and not fluent. And then the opportunity came up to join the ORCID board. That's quite a different world. It's probably a world that most of you are more familiar with than me. Talking to publishers and all that. That's not what you do as a researcher. But I learned a lot, and I think it will be easier for the next few researchers on the board because we've set up protocols and procedures for them to get involved more easily. My most notable achievement, I thought, was that I convinced the board to add a second researcher member because, as you know, I'm a physical scientist, and I was told when I joined the board, "Oh, hello, Richard, you're welcome on the board. You represent all researchers in the world." Now, being a physical scientist, I don't know anything about social science. And so I argued that we should have a HSS, Humanities and Social Sciences researcher member as well. And I'm glad that the board accepted that. It has quite some financial implications because researcher members are sponsored by the board in terms of their travel. Not paid, but all expenses covered. So that's my background. As you saw from the flashed slide, we have an eminent panel of research leaders, and I'm going to ask each of them in turn to introduce themselves and address how ORCID features in their work, if at all, and which benefits or challenges ORCID may bring to their work. And I'd like to start with Professor Diana Kornbrod, please.
Hello. Well, I'm an emerita at the University of Hertfordshire, where I worked for many years as a mathematical psychologist and giving advice on statistics and things like that. So I am also a very strong advocate of open science and the way all these zillions of different databases can help us do that. So I've learnt a lot about ORCID as this morning that I didn't know. My university uses Pure, and that had been my main vehicle, and ORCID sort of seemed to come along with it. So I can't even tell you when I joined ORCID, maybe at some stage when I was submitting a paper to a journal, I got an ORCID ID. And the main benefit for me that I saw is that the Pure system that the University of Hertfordshire uses imports all the references from ORCID, sometimes several times. And then you can disambiguate them. If I had all the publications that ORCID was delivering, it would increase somewhat. So, one of the things I learnt from this morning was that not everybody has an ORCID ID. Now, I had sort of assumed, partly because of the research excellence framework in the UK, that everybody had an ORCID, but apparently not, from what people who are administering these things say. I have good contacts with Ellie Hubbard, who is the manager of the Pure at the University of Hertfordshire, and is very helpful whenever I have questions. So, as I say, main advantage is that I get the publications automatically into Pure. As I see all this, I realize that, and Pure, I have a profile, and I've gone to the trouble of putting in all sorts of publications and where I've worked and what have you. I've been looking, as we've been talking about, comparing my ORCID and my Pure profile. My ORCID profile has the publications, but nothing else. And the reason it has nothing else is I haven't filled them in.
Right.
Nice.
Okay. I think that's a good introduction, because we need to have some time.
So that's a very overviewy thing of how I use it, and things which I hope come up, because they really are complicated to me, is all the different places our outputs get stored.
Thank you.
I finished.
Now the next square on my Zoom window is Professor Rod Page. If you can introduce yourself and introduce your links to ORCID.
Hi, I'm Rod Page. I work in an area called biodiversity informatics. And so I guess I would describe my interests primarily. I would like to have a huge global database of millions of species, every species of life that we know about, links to all the scientific papers that describe and discover those species. So that's hundreds of thousands of publications. And I'd like to have that linked to the people who work in that area and have been doing so over the last 2.5 centuries. So we're talking tens of thousands of people. So the idea of being able to link species to the scientific work to those people, I find very appealing. So ORCID IDs clearly relate to that, being an identifier for at least people who are currently alive and working in that field. So I've become interested in what you can do with those identifiers, using the ORCID API to get information and trying to link that to people that I know about who publish taxonomy. So I guess there are a couple of areas that I'm really interested in. One is there's a huge challenge I find as a sort of person playing with data, trying to link an ORCID ID to a person. For example, a common source of frustration, if I'm looking at a list of people, I will search an ORCID website and see there's a person with that name has an ORCID ID. There is no other information at all about that person. No publications, no institutional affiliation or anything. So I think there's what I sometimes call the Gary Larson problem with ORCID, is that the messaging is get an ORCID. And so what people do is they get an ORCID ID and that's it. And because they've been told basically by an institution or a publisher, if you want to publish with us, you need an ORCID ID. And so they fill in their name and an ORCID ID and they've done it. And of course that misses out the fact that what you really want is to link that to your publication or other output. So if you go and look at ORCID as a user looking for people, you'll discover huge numbers of essentially empty profiles, which are enormously frustrating. So I think there's an issue with the messaging. The messaging is too truncated and people meet that criteria of getting an ORCID ID, but nothing useful. Yeah. The other topic, which I guess has come up, which I'm interested in is, so I come from the taxonomic community who are a bunch of, well, grumbly people really. They feel desperately underappreciated, they feel undecided. There's a lot of work that taxonomists do in terms of collecting specimens, curating collections in museums, identifying sometimes tens or hundreds of thousands of specimens that isn't recorded. There are projects now trying to do that, to actually say, here are all these people who've worked in these collections, and we can link the name on a label for a bat or a plant to a person, to an ORCID ID. We can say, oh look, this is another aspect of the work that you've done. It's not a publication, but it is clearly work that's contributing. And there's some really interesting projects forming up. There's one called Bloodhound Tracker, a colleague in Canada who's made that. So it's taking, you can log in with an ORCID ID and it will tell you, oh look, you've identified 10,000 species of particular genus of plant. Well done. So I'm interested in expanding that notion of what work is sort of recorded and linked to an ORCID ID beyond, for example, publications and data sets and so on. So those are the two kind of areas I'm interested in. So vacant, underpopulated profiles, and what else can we link to people's ORCID IDs?
Thank you. Yeah, I can tell you that a lot of those issues were raised at board meetings as well, and it's a struggle. Yes. Right. The next square on my Zoom is Professor Brad Gibson.
Hello all. Yeah, I'm very interested to hear both Diana's and Rod's comments. They echo a number of the similar things that I've been going through. As for what my personal experiences are, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add. I will say that for me personally, just as a researcher, it's not had a particularly big impact on me personally. On my little subset of research area, much like Richard's, is space sciences. We have a singular database that encompasses everything, NASA ADS. It's easy enough to self-contain everything in our field in some sense relative to a lot of the other fields that are out there. So the combination, you know, I can have my own personal library of all of my publications are in there, whether they're refereed, non-refereed, no matter what type, whether it's a talk, they're all in there inside of my ADS library. I have my own Google Sheet, I have my CV. So from a personal sense, okay, it hasn't impacted on me directly. But I can see the value, and in particularly, like Richard, I am an editor for the American Astronomical Society journals. I've been doing it now for coming up on 11 years now, I guess. And I do find, much like Richard echoed, I mean, I can look over that time, for example, the number of submissions that come from China into our journals has gone from a trace amount to, you know, 30%, 40% of the submissions. So you're getting thousands upon thousands of submissions. And I want to draw upon that expertise in China and that as a referee database. And the information is all there. I can go into the reference list of a paper that I've been asked to be editor for, and I can see a paper that looks interesting. I can then jump to ADS to find the paper. If I want to, you know, and within ADS, I can search on ORCID ID by name for my, you know, through the NASA database. But when I have a list of papers that return to me, I cannot hover over a name or click on a name and get an ORCID ID, for example. There is an extra step for me where I have to go to the original source, the journal, to Astrophysical Journal monthly notices. There are just, the information is there, but there's not seamless crosstalk between the journal to the Institute of Physics publishing tool or editor's tool that we use through to NASA ADS. So within my small area, which is fairly self-contained and probably much easier to contain than a lot of the other areas, there's already a disconnect between them, and there's just extra steps of me pointing and clicking to get the information that I need that I find incredibly frustrating. And again, for me personally, just as a space scientist, I spent a couple of days this week going into ORCID and looking at, because it had been a while since I'd been in, and so I hadn't updated my publications, say, from the last couple of years. So there were maybe 30, 40, 50 papers that I needed to pull in. Now, trying to do it quickly, say by linking to Crossref, for example, I tried to do it that way because I didn't want to sit there and manually do them or add them in work line by line. But Crossref returned 65,752 entries for me. I was clearly not going to filter through those to find them. So I had to spend 2 or 3 hours adding these 40 or 50 entries click by click by click, largely because NASA ADS is not linked into ORCID as one of the ones that you can pull in. So I found that frustrating for me, and just entering things manually. There's a lot of, I can do it by DOI, for example, but there's a lot of pull down menus and clicking and pointing and clicking and dragging. And that's why it ended up taking me several hours to put in 40 or 50 entries one at a time. So I found that a little bit frustrating from that sense, but I can certainly see the power. And if I had a seamless integration of these tools as an editor, it would open up a lot of areas where common names are incredibly difficult to disambiguate. So I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know, but those are my experiences right now. From a university, just one last quick thing and I'll let you go. We use WorkTribe as our central repository and data source for everything at the university. I can go in and link my ORCID ID within WorkTribe, but currently, and I don't think Chris R is on the line, he's more connected to the technical side of things. But right now, at least the whole version that we have with WorkTribe doesn't actually pull anything in. All it does is it links it, but there is absolutely no way within WorkTribe to pull that information in. So if I want my repository or my database at the university level to be complete, I have to once again go in and manually enter these 40 or 50 entries from the last year that I've not been doing, because there isn't a single button I can click to just pull them all in. Now this is probably some simple technical thing, the disconnect between WorkTribe and ORCID, and it needs to be fixed because I've already told our university, you know, I'm not spending the time personally to do this, and I can see that our researchers are not spending the time to do this as well, unless they can get to the point of at least pushing a button and pulling all that information in. We're not populating our WorkTribe database correctly or completely, let's say.
All right, thank you, Brad. And then the final panelist is Professor Simon Tanner.
Okay, hi everybody. Great to hear from loads of real great experts on this. I come from an arts and humanities background, so I'm in the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London. I'm also have an academic leadership role as Pro Vice Dean for Research Impact in Arts and Humanities. And so I see this from both sides, both as an academic practitioner myself. I have shared my ORCID ID in the chat, so you can see how badly or well I'm doing that. I have no idea what is good in this space, just so that people can give me feedback and tell me if I'm doing it well. And also from an academic management perspective, where we're trying to, we want to encourage as many academics as possible to have an ORCID ID. It will make things like REF easier. It does make other activities we want to do more possible and easy as well. But there are resistances to take up around this and problems that are sort of quite specific to arts and humanities. For me, the disambiguation is a really big plus of ORCID. And that's really about a point of principle to a certain extent, the principle of do we know who, when we're talking about a formal publication, do we know who the author is? Are we able to review that person's work? Are we able to review that work in relationship to a body of work? Can we relate that around to each other aspects? And particularly for early career researchers, I feel like ORCID is important as a mechanism for them being able to receive appropriate credit for those works. Often early career researchers are part of larger research teams, multiple authors. So ORCID is a way of ensuring that they are actually getting the credit for that work and along those lines. At King's, we're using Pure. Most of the ORCID entries you'll see have actually been uploaded by my institution. So I put those records into Pure, and then they have linked that to the ORCID record and made those updates. That can be frustrating because sometimes the library at King's and the research data managers at King's will make changes to my record in terms of research publications to fit with their needs for the research excellence framework or for internal data management perspectives, and then that gets uploaded to my ORCID, and I'm like going, well, my ORCID is mine, but actually you've made a change that I'm not very happy with. So one of the changes I'm not particularly happy with is that my institution is absolutely obsessed with using my middle name. I hate my middle name. I never use it in any of my publications. I never use it as an identifier for myself, but they are obsessed with me being Simon George Tanner. And it's just one of those things. However, I can see why that's there. I personally am like going, well, my ORCID ID is my disambiguation. You don't need my middle name for that. But I can see why it's there. There's another Simon Tanner who works in the NHS in London. He probably gets emails for me. I get emails for him. And particularly at this moment in time, it's pretty important that people are reading the right Simon Tanner for medical advice, not coming anywhere near my stuff. So that sort of thing really matters. Where it's unusual from an arts humanities perspective, and I'll just quickly finish with this, is that arts humanities is very book focused in terms of publication. So and one of the tricky things there is books with multiple authors and book chapters, often not being picked up in bibliographic systems, not being picked up in anyone's bibliometrics, certainly not being picked up in citation metrics appropriately, all those sorts of mechanisms. And I think that ORCID has a role there. But also I did an analysis of research outputs for the 2014 REF with a focus on academic books, looking at where academic books were coming from, how they've been published and all those areas. And one of the things we found was in that study was how fallible ISBNs were as a means of identifying a book and as a useful way of saying this was the actual book that was engaged with. And so it occurs to me that there's issues here in terms of if I then wanted to use that as a mechanism for discovery of authors, it wasn't going to work for me as a useful thing. So having both the ISBN and the ORCID there are key areas in terms of ensuring proper credit and being able to reflect back on that. I'll come back to some other thoughts and some crazy ideas I might have later on in the Q&A.
Thank you. Actually, responding to you with wearing my hat as former board member, your ORCID is yours, and it's entirely up to you what's done there. You must have given permission to your institution to write it.
I have, yes, because that makes my life easier. But it's also frustrating when they write stuff that I slightly go, oh, come on.
Yes, exactly. Now, looking at the time where it's marching on, unfortunately, all of you have actually addressed 1.5 out of 3 questions I have, so that's not a problem at all. I'd like to ask the panel maybe 2 more questions, well, let's say 1 more question, and then open it up to the floor for further discussion. And so one of the key things that you as researchers can advise, I guess, the community of librarians and database managers and publishers on is, well, you've told us what's changed already in the context of ORCID in your daily professional life. What changes would you like to see next? So who can I give the floor? What's missing? What do you really need? Yes, Diane.
It is the integrated, what we hear, everybody, there are a large number of institutional databases that institutions are using, and good integration with those is obviously key. The other thing that I would like to see is the disambiguation, because I'm extremely confused about it, is where if you've got a publication, where is the publication of record? I go into my Pure at the University of Hertfordshire, and some of the references are published manuscripts, some of them in open access journals, some of them in non-open access journals, and there's a link to open them. Now, I'm presuming that that's coming from the journal, not from my university's repository. And there are other things which are sort of working papers that I've put in, which there's a link which I've uploaded the document, and I'm assuming that that's stored somewhere on the university's website. At the same time, I am putting things in the OSF. So I've produced some guides to open science, which I haven't yet got into my Pure thing, but it's sitting on the OSF at the moment, the Open Science Federation or whatever it's called. And I will obviously put it into Pure as well, but which is the one of record? How does it all get put together?
Does anyone care to comment on that? Any other comments?
It's just a wish list to get it coordinated.
Right. Yeah, there are lots of little issues that we run into as researchers. I've noticed the same, but I'd like to hear from the other panel members as well. Simon?
Yes, so I think, this is my crazy put this out there idea. This is not King's policy. This is not, this is my personal thing. So one of the things I'd like to see ORCID being used for is in diversity and inclusion policies and practices. So one area is that King's has signed up to DORA, which is about not using bibliometrics and citation analyses and those sorts of things for appointment decision making. But part of that also is a slight challenge, which is that when you get a CV of someone in front of you, you've got their name and you've got that attached to particular publications, etc. And one of the things that I know colleagues have experimented with, which other people have experimented with, which has assisted with diversity and inclusion, so that you're removing an element of unconscious bias, which is being more approving of names that you recognize that are closer to your cultural background, would be to be able to insert ORCID IDs for names. It's not about anonymity, but it would be about inserting ORCID IDs for names, so that we weren't just looking at things and going, oh, I trust this work because it is a nice, you know, it's a nice name I recognize, like Simon, which feels familiar to me, you know. And you're actually then looking at the title of the paper, you're actually looking at the paper, you're actually reading the paper. Obviously, when you go and see it, you'll see the name, but you won't have had that instant unconscious bias, which is about name orientation or about gender orientation that you may think that you can assume from the name along those lines. So there may be a, you know, this is a really crazy out there idea. I don't think this is practical in the short term, but this is where some of the benefits could come, both in the aspect of both the disambiguating, but then the opportunity to use it as a way of avoiding some of the pitfalls of our current employment practices.
Interesting, yes. Brad or Rod, do you have any suggestions?
Well, one thing that sort of strikes me is I think with many things like ORCID, there are a group of people who like the idea and engage with it because it's an identifier. We like linking stuff together. I'm continually struck, and this is sort of harking back to the empty ORCID profile. But I've literally sat in a room with people and been involved in getting them an ORCID ID. And the question has always been, well, what's in it for me? Why would I do this? And I think it's one of those things that the benefits for administrators, for people aggregating information, are pretty clear. The benefits for individuals are often not so clear, or the benefits that we're told we should enjoy, but actually there's no immediate sort of tangible thing. So I suspect it's one of those things that seems like a great idea, but I mean, Brad was sort of talking about, you know, researchers are busy, we've got stuff to do. Doing stuff that makes other people's lives easier isn't necessarily a great selling thing. And these are active, intelligent researchers. They get the idea, they fully understand the reasoning. But it's like, well, why should I spend my time doing this?
Actually, I had exactly the same feeling as you when I first heard about ORCID. That was when I was still a journal editor. As I said, in the third year of my 3-year appointment on the board, it suddenly became useful. And that's because 2.5 years ago, I moved to Australia. In essence, I got an email from the university saying, welcome to Macquarie University. And pretty much the next sentence was, please now link your ORCID to us. And so we're using Pure and ORCID is linked and all that, right? And I was like, yeah, I'll do it. It's okay. They can pull in my papers. It's probably good for their rankings and all that. But why should I care? But then as of about 1.5 years ago, the Australian Research Council, which is one of our main funders, allowed us to pull our publications into a publication record, which took me pretty much 2 minutes rather than 2 hours. Because you can list up to 100 papers. If you have to do it manually, that's an awful lot of work. Now, well, the first time it took me half an hour because the issue is that I uploaded it from ORCID and every single record was imported twice. And that has been fixed. And so it's getting easier and easier. That was the reason behind my final slide at the meeting in Atlanta last year, where I said, ORCID is finally getting useful for me at the end of my 3 years on the board. So, any other comments from the panelists?
No, I was going to mention that one as well because I've been aware of the ARC going to that model, and I can envision if STFC did something equivalent here in the UK from my funding agency, then I can see the benefit. But again, I can echo everything that everyone else has said, and Rhoda just eloquently stated when talking to my staff about their benefits. That's the number one question is, look, my workload is currently 168% in the official university workload. Why should I spend a couple hours a month updating these entries? Absolutely. And it's a difficult one to answer. But there are some increasing ways in which it does benefit the individual, and the one that you just mentioned is potentially one of them. But certainly from my perspective, it's just better integration across these different platforms. As an editor, it would make my life much easier, and completeness between the different databases that are out there. I can search for myself in Crossref or Scopus or NASA ADS or Web of Knowledge, and I get different things in each one, and ORCID is not complete unless I manually go and input them. So it becomes incredibly frustrating when if I go to web of, I just did a test right now on one of these, cross-ref and Scopus, and it comes back with 268 items rather than 501 that I have in NASA ADS, which I know is complete. So there's incompleteness across all of these, and how much time am I going to spend to go through and make sure my Scopus ID is linked up to my ORCID one, which is linked up to my cross-ref, and they all have exactly the same numbers in them. It's an enormous amount of work to do that, and it's, so I do what I can, but as an editor, that's where I could really benefit the most from it.
Right, I fully agree. Now, we've reached the end of our time, but we have a question from the floor. Adam, can we ask that question? So let's take that time anyway, because Adam is muted. Question from Monica. Monica's wondering if our participants from member institutions encounter the holdouts who refuse to sign up as mentioned by Lee. Any comments from the floor?
Yes.
I don't see anyone, but
yes,
go for it.
Just a handful of people. Yeah, I've had a few people who have said, no, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to be identified by a number. I'm a name, not a number. So there is an old school Luddite, small, tiny fraction who say, look, I don't believe in a national identity card. I don't believe in a unique identifier for my name either. It's not logical necessarily. And it's a tiny fraction. But I've had one or two people come back with that response.
It's a bigger fraction in arts and humanities, but some similar reasons, but also it's just the lag. So when we compare, because I sit on college committees for research data management, when we compare arts and humanities uptake of things like, how often do they log into Pure and actually update their records in Pure? How often do they update anything digital? Do arts and humanities researchers believe that they have research data that needs managing? We find that often there's a very high number of them who say they don't think that it's anything to do with them. They think it's to do with STEM subjects only. So it's not necessarily an active resistance in the same way as saying, I don't want to be a number, but it can be a very passive resistance in arts and humanities, which is just, if no one's going to make me do it, I'm going to just ignore it as long as I possibly can, because it's just a digital thing I don't really want to have to engage with.
It looks like we have a few vocal people in the audience who are airing their grievances, so have a look at the chat. But given that we're running over time, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for your input, and I'm handing over to Adam. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thank you all very much for that. It's really helpful, especially for those of us who are trying to get the issue of the empty ORCID profile addressed as we try and move our advocacy away from get an ORCID profile to have an ORCID profile that is useful and has something in it. And that's something we've been discussing amongst the kind of community discussion lists for a while now. So it's great to hear that that's something that people would like. And as we try and figure out how best to communicate those benefits. So thank you all for everything that you've said. That's been a really great session for all of us.
Plans. So some of you may have seen this slide. Well, you will have, if you attended last week, you would have seen this slide. And so this year marks 5 years of the UK ORCID consortium. And one of the ways we had hoped to bring everyone together is through the medium of cake. Like, who doesn't like cake? So we're calling it Bake It or Fake It. So it requires your participation. So we're inviting people to either bake a cake, if you can get a hold of the flour or the eggs, obviously, or it can be faked. You can decorate a tin or draw something, or it can be teched, create a augmented reality or a VR web cake, and the cake should have based on the green ORCID Green Circle ID logo. And we're going to be asking people to send their submissions to this bit.ly link here, and we will send that out again, just to make that clear in terms of the 5 years celebration communication that we do. And what we'll do is we'll create a collage of them and celebrate our favorites at the close of the anniversary celebrations, which will be sometime later this year. And just to say, it's not a competition, but we'll, as I said, we'll pick our favorite. But again, yes, please get involved. It'll be really great to see your creations, and yeah, that'd be marvelous. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. And also, as part of our 5-year celebration, we wanted to kind of mark and remember all of the milestones. And so we're planning an animated presentations of our milestones, featuring events, celebrating progress. I think what we really want to show here is to show how the community has been part of this journey. So it's not just saying, yay, aren't we great? We are great, but it's been a very community driven process, and yeah, we've been doing this together. And I won't do that just yet. Are we back to do? And plus, we're going to be doing some blog posts, series of blog posts as well. Adam, are we ready to? Is it working? Is it not working?
Sorry,
Menti?
I'm trying to find Zoom.
Do I need to come out of?
Yes, if you stop sharing, Balvia.
I stopped sharing.
It looks
Okay.
like it's working now.
I've got a couple.
Does look like it's working.
Okay,
so if we ask everyone to go back to menti.com and use the number 559479, it should now hopefully behave, and it will soon say the presenter moved on to the next slide. Once Adam moves it along.
There you go, right.
So here are the results from the first question, which were all correct.
Well done, everyone.
And on to the second question.
This now breaks the night. There you go.
ORCID is only useful for those in STEM disciplines, true or false? And the results are coming in. If you want to switch back to the Zoom, they will be displayed there.
He said, holding his breath. Ah, gee whiz.
IT gods are really not on our side
They're
today.
really not liking us today.
No.
Oh dear. Right.
So I think
in that case, what I might do is just try the stream 3 ones if the quiz isn't working.
Yeah.
There's something something terrible has happened to the quiz.
I think we can save the quiz and we'll try and add it on to one of the other activities. Yeah.
So sorry about that, everyone. But what I will do is try this one. So it should. That's
yes,
I've seen.
That's displaying correctly now.
So, Monica, do you want to?
So if you go back to Mentimeter, menti.com with the number 559479 if you need to reload. This is a list of topics that have been suggested, and this is replacing our usual breakout groups. Of course, this year we have the advantage that we don't have to choose parallel sessions. We will try and hold as many of these as is practical and depending on the interest. And there's a different number of topics that you can express your interest in, and we will try and organize these in the next weeks, months, to replace our usual breakouts to have more of a discussion style. So just to talk through them while you vote, the first is to do with the work types in the registry, and this is very much linked to this issue of the other label for works and trying to expand that to meet the needs, amongst others, of the practice-based research community, and then Lee mentioned dataset as a type. Then the other two topics are around HR systems. We had a good example from Kent of how those two are linked with the system that collects the ORCID IDs, and thinking on to what you do then with that collection and submitting to other bodies that want to track the journeys of researchers. And one of our panelists mentioned equality and diversity, and actually this was submitted by one of the community as a topic to discuss managing identity via the registry. And then we've got some ideas around an ORCID advocacy toolkit. There's discussions about managing your identity through authentication, SSO, and the OpenID connector, which is a new technology. And I think the votes are still coming in, so I'll keep going. And there's some discussions around how do you define maturity when our systems mature. We've had comments from the panelists again about what seamless integration looks like. Is that when it becomes a mature technology, or is it when everyone has an ORCID record ID? Is that enough? We would like to continue some work on the Corda work, which is a dashboard for managing the ORCIDs from an institutional viewpoint, which ORCIDs are in the ORCID registry, which ones are connected to your internal systems, where are the ORCID IDs, who's got one, who hasn't, who do you need to reach out to, what would be a useful way, what would be useful views to look at that information. We've got interest in Wikidata as a place to link ORCID IDs. We'd like to have a discussion here for you. What else can we do as a community to connect and discuss? We usually have a meeting. We offer up new members Q&A, so if there's enough interest, we can offer that. And then something else we can offer is like a drop-in surgery. We can just turn up and ask any questions, although you're very welcome to do this through the help desk. But this would be a different way of just putting an online session for people to drop by and chat about ORCID. So there's still some more votes coming in. Thanks very much for that. Adam, how much longer do you want to leave it open?
Maybe we'll give it another 15 seconds. We've got 17 votes so far. We've got 30 people on the call. So I'd give people another 15, 20 seconds. Monica's now fully explained all of your options.
And by all means, come back to us if for whatever reason Menti isn't working for you. Just come back and let us know what you'd like to discuss through our help desk as usual.
Thanks, Diana. And thanks for the plug for Metadata 2020, Neil. Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting meeting. Okay, so the next one is just if we've missed anything out, there's an opportunity to stick it in. So if you have any other, we're just going to leave this up for 1 minute. So if you have any other breakout ideas that we haven't covered, please submit them now and we can have a look at them. And again, if you don't want to put them up here in public, please feel free to put them on the contact details that will be coming up shortly in the closing slide. And we've got one more question after this. Thanks for that. There's lots of things I'd wish to know. Monica, are you ready for the last?
I think it's over to Bolivar to close now.
Well, no, there's one more question. Okay, I'm going to move it on to the last thing. Did you want to say about Teams?
Okay. So this next question is an idea again around how do we connect and communicate as a community. And one option is to have a Teams community where you can have discussions and some subtopic discussions. So it's a bit like a mailing list, but it's slightly different in the dynamics. And here we're just asking, is this a type of platform or format that people have used and find easy to access, or does it make you go, oh no, I don't know what this is, or I've used it and I hate it, no thanks. So we're just looking here to get a first reaction is if this is something worth exploring as a support team to offer as a community discussion. Okay, does that look like all the votes have come in? You can keep voting on the Mentimeter and we can move on to stay within time.
Yeah.
Or you can put comments in the chat around Teams. Thanks for that suggestion. Yes, that's one of the advantage we would hope is that we could link it with documents and shared resources.
Yeah, just to Robin, just to comment on Slack, for various reasons, for official channels, we need to use Teams. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Balvier or Monica, do you want to do the last couple of slides? Actually, put the slides up, or I can. Balvier, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I can put the last slides up. Bear with me and share. I've only got 2 slides to go. Bear with me, I'm just going to move the slides on. Here we go. So just to say, can everyone hopefully see these slides?
Yep.
Good. So in terms of getting in touch with us, these are our contact details and channels of communication. And some of you know these already, but yeah, this is how to get in touch with us. And so just finally to say a really big thank you to all the presenters and the panelists, and yeah, thank you for a really full and interesting discussion, and especially to those people who were able to join at the very last minute and then agree to do it at the very last minute. And we will be making the recordings available on Zenodo and on YouTube, and we'll send out that communication. And again, thank you to everyone, all our ORCID members who are on this call, and other people who are on the call who aren't ORCID members. But yeah, thank you for this participation, and we'll send out more information about the third stream webinars that we're planning to do. And so yeah, hope everyone keeps safe, and we look forward to your cake creations in the up and coming months. So thank you all, and I'm calling this webinar to a close.